Yes, they dress up, and they also stuff
According to the customs of this university, I open this academic session with the following words. Spiritus Sancti Gratia illuminat sensus et corda nostra. Please take your seat. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you here at Radboud University, Nijmegen, either here or in this room or following the ceremony via the live stream. A special word of welcome to you, Ms. Mamus, and the people who are assisting you in the defense of your thesis, the paronyms Anita Slonimska, Sho Akamina, and Yashim Azure. Welcome to you all in this academic session. In turn, I will present the members of the examination board later, but before that, I already present three persons, but the third one is not visible yet at this moment. The supervisors, Professor Jurek, Professor Mahid, is present through Zoom, and the co-supervisor, Dr. Speed. They are not going to ask you any question because we think that they already had a lot of opportunities to discuss with you all the things you have written and have done. So I start now with the defense. Oh, no, wait, no. I'll first give the floor to the candidate to present her summary of the thesis. Please.
With the permission of the doctorate board, in order to obtain the degree of doctor from Radboud University, Nijmegen, I would like to defend in public my dissertation entitled Perceptual Experience Shapes How Blind and Sighted People Express Concepts in Multimodal Language. We experience objects and events through multiple perceptual channels, such as vision and audition. And we also describe our experience in language using different modalities, as in speech and gesture. Imagine you hear an event without seeing what's happening. Or you might watch the same event without sound. Or you might watch the same event and hear its sound at the same time. Do you describe this event similarly in language in all these conditions, or does the modality of input change how you talk and gesture about concepts? We know perceptual channels have different affordances and not all modalities are the same. They provide different types of information. Compared to auditory input, vision has the advantage of providing simultaneous and detailed information for both close and distant space, and visual information is continuously present in front of our eyes to update information such as motion, location, and spatial relations. Thus, vision is considered better at perceiving spatial information. On the other hand, audition provides sequential information, but has also advantages compared to vision. It is better at perceiving time-related information. Given these differences between perceptual modalities, does perceptual experience matter? Experience of blind people who are blind from birth provides an opportunity to explore this question. Indeed, there are many studies investigating blind people's experience, but these studies differ in their answers to this question. Some argue that no, perceptual experience doesn't matter, while others claim yes, it matters. Regardless of their answers, most of these studies focused on how blind and sighted people understand concepts through written or spoken language. But we know that language includes not only speech, but also gesture. So the answer of this question is unclear because we know only little about how blind people use language and use it multimodally, thus both in speech and gesture. To address these gaps in my PhD, I asked whether perceptual experience changes how people talk and gesture about concepts. To answer this question, I had 3 experimental chapters in my thesis, which explored both momentary as well as long-term effects of perceptual experience on descriptions of different concepts. In all chapters, I examined Turkish-speaking adults. In chapter 2 and 3, I focused on event descriptions in speech and gesture, and in chapter 4, I focused on object descriptions using only gesture without speech. For the sake of time, in this presentation, I'm only going to talk about the main results of each chapter. In chapter 2, I compared how Turkish-sighted people describe events in their speech and gesture when they watch the events versus when they only heard the sounds of the events, like we have just experienced. Next, in order to test the long-term effects of having visual experience on event descriptions, in chapter 3, I compared Turkish-sighted people's descriptions with descriptions of people who are blind from birth. And lastly, in chapter 4, I compared whether having visual experience, so being sighted or blind, changes how object concepts are represented in gesture only. In chapter 2 and 3, for the event description task, I used motion events. Motion events are central to everyday life, and they involve different elements. First, there is a figure who performs a motion, and there is a landmark which can be a starting or ending point of the motion. And the figure moves in relation to the landmark, which is called path, showing the trajectory of the motion. Finally, how this figure performed the motion is called manner. Therefore, in this example, a typical Turkish speaker would describe this event as koşarak kapıya geliyor. So, with the English translation, someone comes to the door running. You may notice from the English translation that different languages have different ways to describe path and manner in language. And because in my thesis I studied Turkish language speakers, my examples will be from Turkish language. Speakers can also describe this event using their hand gestures. For example, they can gesture about the path by showing the trajectory of the motion, like in this example.
Koşarak geliyor.
Let's see the example again.
Koşarak geliyor.
Or they can gesture about the manner, showing how the motion is performed, for example, by showing someone run, or showing the rhythm of the motion, like in this example.
Bu sefer koştura koştura.
Let's see it again.
Bu sefer koştura koştura.
In chapter 2, I asked Turkish speakers either watch the events or only listen to the sounds, and in their description, I focused on path and manner use as these are 2 main components of the motion events. And I found that speakers who listened to the sounds of the events talked more about the path of the motion. So, for example, they said someone comes to the door, whereas speakers who watched events talked more about the manner of the motion. So, for example, they said someone run. Then I looked at speakers' gesture use, but there was no difference in how much they gestured about path and manner. In summary, in chapter 2, I showed that the perceptual modality of information changes how people describe events, at least in their speech. Next, in order to test the long-term effects of having visual experience on event descriptions, in Chapter 3, I compared Turkish-sighted people's descriptions with descriptions of people who are blind from birth. I compared Turkish-sighted and blind participants with a novel paradigm. I created motion events auditorily by recording the sounds of the events. Both sighted and blind participants listen to the sounds of the events from 5 sound speakers, and I also created 5 movement angles as shown in the picture on the right. The movement either approached participants or moved away from participants. With this paradigm, my thesis contributed to the field also methodologically, as I created a 3D experience of an event happening around participants as in daily life. Here I again focused on pattern manner use in speech and gesture, and I found that blind participants mentioned path of motion more than sighted participants, but they mentioned manner of motion less than sighted participants. And for the gesture use, I found that blind participants gestured less about both path and manner compared to sighted participants. In summary, in Chapter 3, I found that visual experience changes how people describe events, both in their speech and gesture. Lastly, in Chapter 4, I focused on object descriptions instead of event descriptions, and I compared whether visual experience changes how object concepts are depicted in gesture only. Gestures arise directly from people's perceptual and motor experiences with objects, thus providing a unique insight into our knowledge of concepts. I asked Turkish-sighted and blind participants to express different objects in 6 seconds using only their gestures but without speaking, and there were objects from 3 categories: manipulable objects, non-manipulable objects, and animals. Manipulable objects are small and graspable. Therefore, first-hand experience is possible for both blind and sighted participants through touching. However, non-manipulable objects and animals are big objects and not fully graspable. Therefore, first-hand experience is limited for blind participants. Here, I looked at how many gestures participants could produce for each type of categories. And I found that blind and sighted participants produce similar amount of gestures for manipulable objects, which they had first-hand experience, but blind participants produced fewer gestures than sighted participants for non-manipulable objects and animals, which they had limited experience. These findings together suggest that visual experience with objects shapes how those objects are depicted in gesture. So my PhD thesis showed that the perceptual modality of information changes how sighted people describe events in their speech, but not in their gesture. But importantly, when people do not have visual experience at all, this changes how they describe events, both in their speech and gesture. And furthermore, having no visual experience also shapes how objects are depicted in gesture. Taken together, my PhD thesis showed that perceptual experience influences how people describe concepts in speech and gesture in line with the affordances of perceptual information. Having presented this summary of my dissertation, I return the floor to the rector.
We can start the defense. I first give the floor to Professor Meijer. She was the chair of the manuscript committee, and she's from this university at the Max Planck Institute, Nijmegen. Please.
Thank you. Esteemed candidate, first of all, as one does, I would really like to congratulate you with the completion of your dissertation. I really enjoyed reading it and learned a lot about multimodal language use, and it made me think again about the ways that conceptual, linguistic, and sensory information might all be put together and used when we speak and when we gesture. That was really interesting and thought-provoking. I also very much appreciated your very careful and clever experimentation. It's all very nice, and also your very clear writing. So all of this is beautifully done. Congratulations. Now, my questions concern the experimental manipulations that you have in chapters 2 and in chapter 3. So, in chapter 2, you compared the speech and gestures for movement descriptions given by sighted people when only auditory, only visual, or both kinds of information are given, right? And you find clear differences between the audio only and the other 2 conditions. So that's a nice and interesting result. And it shows us how the participants dealt with this particular task when particular kind of perceptual information was given and other was withheld. Okay, fair enough. Now, in chapter 3, you heard blind and sighted people describe movement events, always on the basis of audio-only information, right? So this scenario must have been quite common for the blind people, because I assume this is how they experience the world most of the time. And I can imagine that, therefore, you can make inferences from their task performance here to how perception affects their speech and their gesture. But I think, as in chapter 2, the situation is more unusual for the sighting people, because for them, suddenly the kind of information that is normally typical for perceiving movement events is taken from them. Right? So this brings me then to two questions. The first one is, what do you think follows from the fact that the experimental situation is quite normal or typical for the blind people, but not so much for the sighted people? Does this in some way affect the validity of the comparisons that you can make between the two groups? And the second question, somewhat related to this, is how do you think you can go with your results beyond the use of the perceptual information in this particular task to the use of perceptual or sensory information in general, in speech and language and gesture? Let's do the first one first. So the difficulty, the comparison of the two groups. I would argue that the situation is in some way harder for the sighted people than for the blind ones. Is this a problem?
Okay. Dear opponents, first of all, thank you for your compliments. So for the first question, you're asking whether this, even though this situation is more typical for blind participants, it's not that typical for sighted participants just to have the audio-only information. I mean, I agree. That's in a way, that's why I wanted to include the chapter 2, because we didn't have any baseline for sighted participants having just auditory information. So that's why, in a way, I first wanted to see whether that makes a difference itself first, and then compare it with blind people. And indeed, we show, like I showed in chapter 2, that auditory input has some influence on people's speech, even though not gesture, for sighted people. However, we see in chapter 3, actually...
Hang on, can we just stick with chapter 2 for a minute?
Okay, sure.
Yeah, so, but my concern here is that you are tapping into strategies which are just generated for, so in the audio-only condition, you are tapping into strategies which people generate specifically for this particular task. So what does this tell us about the use of this kind of information for regular speaking and gesturing? I mean, if I am imagining doing this, I could say, all right, for instance, the path information might be much easier to derive, perhaps, from the input than the manner information, and this is what I will focus upon. Isn't that a concern?
That's true. I mean, I think it's not a concern, because that was, in a way, the aim of to understand the affordances of the perceptual input. Of course, it's not that normal, but I would imagine that there may be scenarios that people, even though they don't see, because of the circumstances, that like sighted people, like people who can see, but for that moment they cannot see what's happening at their back, but they can hear the sound of the events or things happening behind them. So I can imagine that it's, although it's not that typical in daily life, it's still possible as a scenario to hear the sounds of the motion events. And the study itself showed that, yes, it seems that the affordances of perceptual inputs can lead to changes, because apparently manner information is not extractable as much as from auditory input as much as they can extractable from visual input.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And
chapter 3, yes.
For chapter 3. So yeah, as I mentioned, chapter 2 was kind of baseline for chapter 3 so that we could, because in chapter 3 I wanted to really equate the input modality for both blind and sighted people. Because, I mean, there is only 1 or 2 studies before me doing like any multimodal language production study without visual input, and they used haptic information to create motion events. But I imagine that it's maybe more, even less reliable than what I have presented to people, because you cannot, in that study, blind people touched the certain dolls and certain scenarios to understand the motion event, which is not a typical experience. And whereas sighted people and blindfolded sighted people, they had to see the scenario without touching, so it was different inputs, but inputs have different affordances. But auditory information was in a way more reliable because at least it covered everyone's experience. In real life to some extent, although not fully, of course. And interestingly, I also found that even though sighted people's descriptions change when they only heard the events, blind people's descriptions were even more different than sighted people's descriptions who got only auditory input. So this already suggests not just the effect of perceptual input, but more extended effect of having a certain type of perceptual experience or not.
Right, thank you.
I now give the floor to Professor Kita from the University of Warwick, United Kingdom. Please.
Thank you, esteemed candidate. Thank you very much for giving me opportunity to read this really interesting thesis. I think it's a really innovative idea to think about input modalities and how that has impact on the speaking and gesturing and the relationship between the two. I think it's really, it gave me kind of a new way to think about, multimodal communication. So it was really stimulating thesis. And my question concerns chapter 4 about silent gestures. And so you compared blind people and sighted people and how they produce silent gestures for various objects. And so for example, you found differences between the two groups. For example, sighted people produced more drawing gestures than blind people for all 3 types of objects. And so that's very interesting. And my question is, exactly how to interpret that. So your interpretation was that this gesture difference indicates conceptual representation, differences in conceptual representation. And I think that makes sense because, blind people have no visual experience of the world. Therefore, concepts of the objects in the world will be probably different. Okay, that makes sense. But also, blind people, but another thing we have to think about is that blind people have no visual experience of communication either. Okay, not just the world, but the visual experience of the communication. So another possible interpretation of your result is that maybe, gestural differences reflect the differences in the way these two groups of people understand gestural communication. And so I wonder whether, what you think about this alternative explanation. And also, my second question is, how can we distinguish these two interpretations in future studies? You would probably have to do a different kind of study to do this, but I wonder whether you have any ideas about how to approach that.
Dear opponent, first of all, thank you for your compliments, and I definitely agree with you about the alternative explanation. I think it's not just the one or the other, I believe. I also mentioned a little bit about this alternative explanation in the discussion part of chapter 4, because yes, people have visual experience of objects in life, but also visual experience of communication. So seeing, for example, others' gestures, also maybe having like feedback for their own gestures from addressees. I mean, this cannot be this can be explicit feedback, of course, like verbal, or it can be also implicit feedback that we get through visual means. So I agree. I think it's a combination of both, and it's not easy to tease them apart. I mean, in chapter 4, to be able to tease them apart, I tried to use an alternative, like another measure, which is a feature listing task, to tap, because this task is valid and mostly commonly used in the literature to understand people's conceptual representations. So, and what I found, when we ask people to describe the most important features of a concept, I didn't find much differences, to be honest, especially in the perceptual features. There were differences only for the animal concepts in the perceptual features reported by blind and sighted people. This is more in line also with the gesture findings I had, because I found that animal category was the most difficult one for blind people. They skipped almost half of the trial, so they couldn't come up with any strategy for animal category. And it's in a way also reflected in their features listings, because they also listed fewer perceptual features for animal categories compared to sighted people. So together, I think they help me to differentiate between gesture results together with feature results help me to differentiate between the effect of perceptual experience, so the effect of conceptual knowledge from the effect of having visual communication experience. For example, for manipulable object category, even though I found differences in the gesture strategies for non-manipulable objects, I didn't find much difference from the features. So even though people, for example, could report a shape or size of a non-manipulable objects, they couldn't come up with a drawing strategy in their gestures. So this suggests that they may have the conceptual information, like size of shape information of the concept, but because maybe they don't have the experience of how to transform that abstract knowledge to a gesture, like a visual modality, they couldn't come up with a drawing strategy. So I guess, yes, that's the combination of both, but we definitely need more studies to tease them apart in a better and fine-tuned way. Yeah.
And so for the perceptual feature generation task, so you didn't really distinguish visual feature versus other features?
Yes, actually, I haven't done it for the thesis, but I've done it for the publication because it's currently under revision.
I see.
So I recoded perceptual features into like finer detailed modalities. I haven't coded them as visual or auditory, but I coded them as, for example, whether that feature is color related or other visual property related, for example, like light related feature, or about magnitude, size, shape, or sound, etc. And I found that blind people produced fewer like color and other visual related properties and fewer than sighted participants, but they actually produced more sound-related and texture-related features than sighted participants. So it's not the case that they are always less in perceptual features, but it's again about the experience probably.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I now give the floor to Professor Kuntay from the Koç University in Turkey.
Thank you. Esteemed candidate, first of all, it was a great pleasure to read your dissertation. Your findings are a real eye-opener and all the chapters are impeccably written. The links from the initial motivations of the studies to the actual findings and the discussions of these findings were beautifully constructed. That's what I thought. So I really congratulate you and your supervisors wholeheartedly for this work. So the only questions that I had actually about this dissertation was how your findings your discussions of these findings could be expanded. So how would you think your findings would generalize to languages other than Turkish? Turkish-like languages and non-Turkish-like languages. So do you see also any obstacles in conducting similar studies in other languages, so make it more cross-linguistically feasible? So, or do you think any of your findings are really specific to Turkish?
Dear opponent, first of all, thank you for your compliments. First of all, I definitely want to extend my work with a different language typology like English other than Turkish, because Turkish is, yes, PET dominant language, let's say, whereas English is more manner dominant language. These language typologies also, of course, change people's focus when they observe or experience an event, which in turn, of course, affects their descriptions during like online production. And definitely some of my results may be shaped by language typology of Turkish. So it would be interesting to replicate the study with another language to see how the modality of input would affect for example, a manner dominant language. Because what I found in chapter 2, for example, people having only auditory input talked less about manner information, but manner is already omittable in Turkish when people describe motion events. So maybe it's maybe yes, auditory input from like maybe it's extracting manner information from auditory input is challenging, but therefore maybe it's easier for a Turkish speaker to drop the manner information, because if the person couldn't get the information exactly, maybe it's and because the person maybe already focuses on PET more than manner, the effect is bigger for Turkish, let's say, compared to in English speakers. So I definitely agree that this was the first baseline, but it should be extended for another language. And I believe there will be also the effect of language to some extent, but yeah, so it will be interesting to see the results, I would say.
So it could be, you're saying that it could be specific to, satellite languages or verb-based languages, basically, your findings?
To some extent,
To some
yes.
extent,
Yeah.
especially chapter 2.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I now switch to the Zoom and give the floor to Professor Collignon from the University of Louvain in Belgium.
Thank you very much. So, esteemed candidate, first I would like to apologize not to be there to celebrate this moment with you. It was just like logistically impossible for me. But I thank you anyway for offering me the opportunity to read your thesis. I really enjoyed it. I think it was very well and clearly written. It was really fun to read. And I also, like my colleagues, think that merging this idea to compare speech and gesture in different modalities and different populations having different experiences, not only original, but very compelling and probably opening new avenues for research. So that's very nice of you to open that for the field, I think. So I'll start with maybe a first question about the first study, where you take the premise that basically different modalities give different affordance, right? And you are, in my thought, a little bit radical, in a sense that you say like vision is holistic and spatial, audition is sequential and non-spatial. You write that in your thesis, and I think I went to your stimuli because also one very nice thing that you did for us is to provide access to your stimuli through OSF. So I went there, I listened and watched to your stimuli, and clearly your videos provide sequential information, information following in time, and when I listen to your sounds, I can clearly extract spatial information from them, right? So what probably is, though, the case is that the salience of this sequential and spatial information are different across modalities. So I'm wondering if the conclusion you make about the fact that vision influence conceptual representation or encoding in such a way versus audition in another way is really due to vision or audition, basically the sensory input that is used, or is it just the salience of the information that is entering the system that is influencing the encoding of these events? So therefore, if you would have altered the reliability of the visual information and enhanced the reliability of the auditory one, you would have potentially switched the effect you have.
Dear opponents, first of all, thank you for your for your compliments. So you're asking whether the differences in encoding is just because first you mentioned that we can also extract spatial information from auditory or from non-visual perceptual input, and then you ask whether the differences in the descriptions is just the affordances of the inputs, or whether, for example, people can be, or whether we can improve the input quality, or maybe even maybe people can be trained to get more information from certain perceptual input. So first, I agree with you about having spatial information from non-visual input as well. Of course, we can also get spatial information from auditory, even though it's sequential or less holistic than visual input, let's say. But what I meant is just to make a kind of caricaturized version of the differences to indicate that visual information is usually dominant in terms of spatial perception, in spatial perception. And second, about affordances, I also agree with you. I think it's possible that we can produce maybe better quality input, or like as sighted people, we are more tuned to get spatial information from visual input alone, maybe. So because for example, I didn't find a difference between visual only versus visual plus audio condition. So this suggests that visual alone provides enough information for sighted people. There are also, of course, some studies suggesting that multimodal input provides richer information, of course, but that was not the case for my findings. But yeah, it may be possible to improve our input quality and also maybe even train people. For example, if you think about it in a broad sense, blind people are trained to get certain information from non-visual perceptual input, right, from haptic and auditory. So it must be possible for sighted people too to train themselves to get more information. For example, blind people are also very good at echolocation, so relying auditory input for spatial information, etc. So this must be true for sighted people too. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if I have time for a second question or if I keep that for an eventual or potential second round.
If you have another question, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I feel tempted to ask this question about blindness, given my background, and a previous professor also asked about, like, you know, the communicative aspect. So I'm not going to that, but I was very intrigued by the results that you have in your last study. Very interesting, I think, about the fact that it selectively impact. So blindness selectively impact the way they represent animals and scenes, but not manipulable objects, which is something we have seen also in some of our data. And my question is very, I know it's outside of your thesis, so it's I ask you to potentially hypothesize a little bit here, but I would like you to imagine what would be the consequence of this selective change in the conceptual presentation of some specific categories under neurobiology of conceptual representation. So how do you think this selective differences for some specific categories here would impact on the way the brain represents these things? And I guess, interestingly enough, given your introduction, talk about these theories, whether conceptual representation are like amodal representation in the mind versus like grounded on some perceptual experience. So I don't know if you have any idea of how you could use your results to hypothesize how the blind might differ in the way they represent these conceptual information.
And differ neurally, you're asking, or?
Yes. I know it's outside the scope of your own work, but okay. You probably have read a bit about that, so.
Yeah, I've of course read about it, but it's not my expertise, let's say. So we know that, for example, when blind people are better than sighted people when localizing sounds, their visual cortex is also activated compared to people, again blind people, but they're not that good compared to, for example, there are studies comparing early and late blind people, and early blind people are better at localizing sounds, and when compared to late blind people, and when they are better, we also see the plasticity in the brain, and their visual cortex is more activated. There are also studies, for example, showing that when blind people are better in auditory memory, verbal memory, or when they are exploring something tactile, their visual cortex is also engaged, unlike sighted people. So there is definitely a change in the brain, how it's functioned, especially in terms of visual cortex engagement in blind group. And this may be also related when they, keep the information about different features of single objects, like I used in study in chapter 4. I found that, for example, interestingly, blind people, they didn't differ much for the manipulable object concepts, where they can have the first-hand experience through touching, and there. They used a different strategy than sighted people to represent those concepts. For example, they used what I called simultaneous strategy. So they represented the acting, so how you act with that object, like a spoon, but they also showed the concave shape of the spoon. So they also, in a way, they combined these two strategies together, which can be claimed that it's more informative than just having the action with spoon versus showing the concave shape together with the acting. So I'm not sure how they're exactly related to brain changes, but it's definitely has to do something with their perceptual experience with those objects. So they have that. So they add more information, maybe to be more. They think that it will be more, understandable, comprehensible from an addressee perspective. So they add even more information compared to sighted person when they have all the experience, when they have the different experience with these manipulable objects, for example. So that's all I can say, I think.
Yeah, thank you. This is very interesting. What I was thinking also is that probably they use more taxonomic information, for example, for animals or these things. I think you mentioned that, and therefore the language system might be particularly active when they think about animals compared to sighted people, for example. But anyway, thank you very much for your answers.
I now give the floor to Dr. Brouwer from this university.
Thank you. Esteemed candidate, first of all, I would also like to congratulate you with your dissertation. When I heard about your PhD work a couple of years ago, I already got very excited about your topic and was very pleased to be invited on your thesis committee to read all the studies that you have conducted. Comparing blind and sighted people is very unique in our field and also very challenging, especially when there is an outbreak of a virus called corona and the world more or less stops. So as an advocate of the open science movement, I also appreciated it that you always shared your materials publicly. I enjoyed reading your methodological sections, as they were very comprehensible as well as replicable. I especially liked how you created the sounds of biological motion to mimic this 3D real-life auditory experience. Very clever. And finally, I would like to compliment you on creating beautiful plots and using advanced statistical techniques. So, as you see, my compliments are very focused on your methods and your results. So therefore, I would like to ask you a question about these two topics. First, I would like to focus on a methodological question, and only if we get to a second round, I would like to ask you a question on statistics, which might be a relief. My question is about Chapter 2, in which you investigated the production of motion events in different modalities, audio only, visual only, or multimodal, that you just illustrated so nicely. You created video and audio recordings of events with an actress, which you presented to participants with the instruction to describe each event. So you developed a lab study in which you controlled as many factors as possible. But a drawback of this is that it might be harder to generalize these results to the outside world. So if you were allowed to redesign this study in Chapter 2, and you had to increase the ecological validity, so try to get it more externally valid, what would you do? Please try in your answer to be as specific as possible by referring, for example, to maybe a change to the materials, the type of task, the conditions, the type of design. And as a bonus question, would you then expect your results to be different in this new ecologically valid setup?
Okay. Dear opponent, first of all, thank you for the compliments. So it would be really nice to have to increase the ecological validity. Maybe using VR. Actually, that was the very initial idea because my initial proposal was also about this 3D, making the sounds 3D so that it can be more like a real life experience. But back then, I found it a bit challenging to learn the VR technology, and I didn't have maybe all the means. But nowadays it's more possible also in our lab to have maybe that VR experience. So in addition to make people sit among 5 sound speakers, they can be in this like VR cave, and we can even provide a scenario that is more realistic. So this is also maybe partially answers Ance's question. For example, whether something is happening behind their back, so they have the auditory only input but no visual information, stuff like this. So it would be really nice to have such replication. And I would expect, I guess, similar results still even in a VR condition. Yeah, because I think it's really... So, there is another possibility to make it more ecologically valid, to put an addressee in front of them, maybe, as I also discussed in my general discussion, because I ask people to imagine an addressee who will watch later their descriptions and try to match it with the sounds. But of course, having a real addressee, a conversation, changes the whole setup and maybe makes it more realistic. So it can be also nice to add a like avatar in VR that can respond them in a certain way, or that can and control and like make manipulations based on like presence of an addressee or not, with the different version of having sound only, etc. I would expect, without an addressee at least, I would expect similar results, but of course a potential addressee may change the results depending on the common ground between people, or having a certain feedback from the addressee, etc. So that should be explored in the future. Yeah.
Can I ask one follow-up question? A tiny one. So how will you present the stimuli in that setting? How would you do that? So you have those 3 conditions, or how would you still do the same thing, or like show videos, or?
Maybe they can already be themselves in the video, let's say, like as a participant, maybe. So as I imagine a street and maybe a car passing by, like some motion events, or someone walking in front of them or behind them, so they hear.
They're really immersed in.
Yeah, so I think it would be nice to immerse them really in the setup. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
I now give the floor to Dr. Holler from this university.
Thank you. Esteemed candidate, dear Ezgi, I also would like to congratulate you on your thesis. I think it really breaks new ground for reasons you outlined yourself. So on the one hand, the existing field looks primarily at these visual stimuli, and looking at something else, and the auditory domain in particular is really nice. But also, obviously, the populations that we know a lot less about in terms of their cognition and multimodal communication. So I think that's really important contribution. I also thought it was really well written, very clear, but also very succinct, which I really liked. And while I liked the succinctness of the writing, it also is the kind of source of my first question, because I had some questions about your coding scheme for chapter 2, which was succinctly described, but I think a little bit more depth would be nice as well. And in particular, I was wondering whether indeed you just scored the information in gesture and speech in this kind of binary fashion, so just saying for manner and for path, yes, it's either present or it's not present, so a kind of 0-1 type of approach. And if that was the case, which it sounds like, what did you do with the kind of more nuanced aspects of manner that might be distinguishing different forms of walking? So, for example, you can walk quickly or hastily or slowly or casually or anxiously, all of these kind of things, which could be in footsteps that you hear, but also in the motion that you see. Just as one example. And likewise, in gesture, we know that, for example, character viewpoint gestures encode more information or nuances about manner than observer viewpoint gestures, for example. So did you consider that somehow, or was that kind of glossed over and, just lost in this kind of binary scheme?
So dear opponent, first of all, thank you for the compliments. Actually, I coded manner information more like detailed. For example, as you mentioned, I coded it whether it was encoded in the main verb or as an adverbial phrase, something like someone walked quickly or with a stick, for example, instead of limping someone, because it was also possible to say someone went and come, these use of light verbs in the Turkish typology instead of a manner verb, instead of a pet verb saying coming closer or going like more, let's say, not light verb anyway. So yes, I coded them, but at the end, and to be honest, I don't know the percentage of like how much was encoded in the main verb, the manner, or versus adverbial phrase, because at the end I combined them together. But because of the Turkish typology, there were lots of adverbial phrases saying like someone went with a stick, someone walked with a stick, someone walked quickly, slowly, these type of manner information as adverbial phrase. But I haven't done any analysis in terms of comparing them.
Okay, so do they constitute, because in a separate clause, is it then considered a different motion event or part of the same, and you gave it 2 points, or how did it work?
I calculated actually a ratio based on relevant clauses, because first I separated everyone's descriptions into clauses, and those clauses also, for example, if they said someone went running, that's 2 clauses actually. Mm-hmm. And then I first coded the clauses whether they're relevant to the motion event or not, because it's possible that they could have had extra information, like someone or a woman wearing high heels. Probably there's a woman wearing high heels, for example, something like this. Then I coded it as irrelevant clause, and then I calculated manner and pet use ratio per relevant clause.
Yes, that I got from the description as well. But does the adverbial information or these nuances of the adjectival information, let's say, was that counted as an additional data point, or is it part of the someone walking quickly, is that one motion event description or two in terms of manner? Walking and quickly?
That's one clause,
Okay.
yes.
So do you think, that's my question then, do you think doing it in a more, separating it out in these more nuanced facets, distinguishing how somebody is walking, would that potentially change the data and how it looks?
Good question. I think of course it may change the numbers, but would it change the general pattern? Probably no. I mean, because if it's about how much information people who got the auditory information only got extracts about manner, then I think it wouldn't change much. But because I also found that actually people who only got auditory input had fewer relevant clauses. So this means that they maybe didn't understand the event fully, so they tried to make sense. They tried to make sense of the sound, which turned into like some irrelevant clauses. But. I think I should check for that actually.
Yeah, that would be really nice, I think,
to
see
something concrete.
Because you might get that more from the visual or vice versa or something. But oops, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. There are always more questions than answers. That's something that you should keep in mind. But we can go for a second round, and I give the floor to Professor Kita.
So my question is about experiment 2 and 3, and so especially about results about gestures. And you found interesting patterns in chapters 2 and 3, and I was wondering to what extent these patterns come from the fact that the gestures are for communication. And so I was wondering whether if you had used, let's say, something like a drawing task, please draw as much as, please write down how much, as much as you remember by, drawing a picture of what happened or something like this, then, it's not a communication task. And do you think you would have found different things and in these two tasks? And the reason I'm mentioning this is that when it's a communication task, then how salient or new information something is becomes very important, and it's been noted that the information that stands out in the context tends to be gestured, for example. And so there are only 3 kinds of manner in many trials. So manner, if you manner is not very interesting information because there are only 3 kinds, and if you're communicating, but if you're drawing, try to remember exactly what happened. You might still remember these details very much, and you might draw more of that. So I wonder, how much of the patterns you found in gesture comes from the fact that gesture is a communication medium, as opposed to it's not just the output of your memory of what you remember from the scene.
So you're asking whether these gesture results may arise from the fact that they kind of copy what they experience,
right,
like visually.
Right.
But of course, gesture is part of the communication, but drawing is still a visual modality, but maybe not for communication.
Right.
So would it be difference in between those tasks? I may imagine, again, because of first Turkish typology, people would focus maybe more on pet than manner, and maybe for drawing, I mean, I guess it's a bit about the motivation of the drawing, because like Talmi considers pet is the more like core component of the motion event. So one may think that in a drawing, people may want to just show the direction of the movement, so someone moving from left to right, because that's maybe more critical, showing the path of the motion. Yeah, and Of course, that may also depend on the perceptual input, because for when there is the visual input, of course, people, maybe it's, yes, I claim that it's easier to extract the memory information, and maybe it's easier to draw because you have you may copy what you have seen there more easily. Maybe because we see that people, when they run, they open their legs wide, so maybe it's easier to copy it on the paper, representing the legs wide open, maybe even without noticing. But yeah, for gestures, of course, gestures affected by language typology as well. So, and because my speakers were Turkish speakers, they had almost in all conditions, predominantly pet-only gestures. Yeah, and some manner gestures were also bodily manner gestures. So instead of showing the wide open legs, for example, they showed someone run with the bodily own experience. So I think these are the main differences between a drawing task versus a communication task. But I think we should test it to see what exactly would differ. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much. That's interesting.
I now give the floor again to Professor Kuntai.
Thank you. So about the perceptual experience of blind individuals, I didn't encounter much of a discussion about their tactile experiences in your dissertation, because you're not manipulating it and so forth. But lack of visual experience may be somewhat compensated by tactile experience, obviously. In early joint interactional experiences, we see parents of blind children basically put things in their hands, and more than sighted children. So any thoughts about how tactile experiences about objects and actions, whether they can affect speech and gesture, and how, your findings in general?
I think, yes, there is definitely an effect of haptic experience, more, let's say, maybe because they relatively rely more on haptic experience than a sighted person. And I see it actually for the chapter 4, when they have the manipulable objects. So because these objects are graspable, technically sighted people should also have the tactile information how to manipulate a spoon. But for example, we see that the sighted people just show the acting strategy, whereas blind people show acting instead of, and together with the shape of the object, showing the tactile experience of the object too.
The defense is hereby concluded. I give the floor once again to the candidate.
Having defended my dissertation to the best of my ability, I would like to thank you, Rector, and you, my supervisors and co-supervisor, and all who have honored this ceremony with their presence.
The Doctoral Examination Board retreats for its deliberations. On behalf of the Council of Deans of Radboud University Nijmegen, we have decided to award you the degree of doctor. I invite Professor Azurek to discharge the task assigned to her.
With the power entrusted by law to the doctorate board, I hereby confer upon you, Ezgi Mamus, born in Istanbul, the title of doctor from Radboud University Nijmegen, to which are attached all the associated legal and customary rights and duties with respect to academia and society. As proof thereof, I present you with this doctoral diploma, signed by the rector and the doctoral thesis supervisor and co-supervisor.
Please take your seat. The laudation will be delivered by two persons. Dr. Speed will start.
Dear Dr. Mamus, I think I'm the first one to say doctor. Since ASFA wasn't able to attend in person today, I'm delighted to be given the opportunity to congratulate you as well as share some words from ASFA. Your original daily supervisor was Lilia Risman, and she would like me to pass on the message that she was glad to have the opportunity to work with you in the early days of your PhD, and she wishes you well for the future. When I returned to Nijmegen, I was thrilled to become your daily supervisor. The topic of your PhD fascinated me, and I was intrigued what insights we could gain into conceptual representation from gesture. Now, it's common to have a few struggles during a PhD, but you were particularly unlucky, as we've heard, in being a PhD student in 2020. Unfortunately, your work was interrupted by COVID, and you sustained an injury and had to recover. But despite these setbacks, it was striking how you always remained calm and resilient to continue your research. And this calmness and resilience also proved helpful when navigating comments from three supervisors who sometimes differed in opinion, as well as completing hours of coding without complaining, at least not to us. Everyone knows you're a lovely person to be around and have as a friend. I always looked forward to our meetings where we'd get a coffee, sometimes cake, and walk around the campus. I enjoyed scrutinizing your data together and admiring your beautiful figures. I'm very proud of you and your accomplishments. 2, almost 3 published chapters, multiple talks at international conferences, a review article, public engagement, teaching. It's been a pleasure to see you develop into a confident researcher, and I'm pleased that you're staying around in Nijmegen. Today isn't about the end of your PhD, but the start of your career where you'll no doubt accomplish many more wonderful feats. Now to share some words from ASFA. I'm very sorry not to be there in person to celebrate this landmark with you, but it's been wonderful to share the journey with you. When you began your thesis, I told you that doing a PhD is a marathon, not a sprint. You have to keep a steady pace, and when you begin to falter at the 40th kilometer, you have to keep going because the end is almost there. I have fond memories of you editing your audio files in the corner office of the Erasmusgebouw late into the evenings, and listening to those tracks again and again until you were satisfied with them. Now that painstaking work has led to important theoretical contributions to the scientific literature and culminated in this wonderful dissertation. You finished the marathon. After a marathon, it's important to rest and recuperate, perhaps do some stretches, and most importantly, to celebrate. And then you can begin to plan for your next major event. I look forward to seeing what you do next, whatever it may be. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So, dear Ezgi, Dr. Mamus, here we are at the end of the marathon, the 17. Yes, you made it. And we have known each other more than 5 years now. In 2016, you wrote me an email saying you're interested in blind individual gestures and you wanted to find out if gestures are generated from imagery and if there were stimulus effects in how we elicit gesture usually in gesture studies. Even though I didn't know much about blindness and I was young as an advisor, I accepted this offer. Now I'm a bit much more selected to emails coming to ask for PhD positions. And of course, this was also facilitated by Asfa Majid agreeing to co-supervise you. You managed to obtain a very competitive fellowship from CLS and managed to answer all the questions you asked initially. Isn't it nice? However, this was not easy but a challenging marathon. You had to collect your data in Turkey with special populations to begin with. And you also had to create these 3D sound effects there. So you carried all the equipment from here to there, which was very challenging. And we are also grateful to your partner, Özcan, with all the help. And there was also, as mentioned, COVID during your last study. So you had to collect data from blind individuals from online, and this was very challenging. And you also unfortunately had an accident and had a knee surgery, and you had to recover from that. So this all happened during your PhD. And you survived all that, because I think you are a survivor. In all these challenging... I will try at some point. In all these challenging conditions, you were in a good mood, and you were someone actually who really enjoys life no matter what. You're into good food, you know how to make good cocktails, Aperol spritz in particular. You love travel, and sailing is your hobby. And you are the gourmet and the Google map of the lab. So whoever gets to go to a conference trip with you is very lucky to go to a conference with her. And we also know that you're into competitive sports, and you beat everyone on volleyball, bowling, table football, and table tennis. So over the years, you became one of the all-knower of the lab, and now we all rely on you how to run the lab. As new people come and ask me a question, I always say, ask Ezgi, please. So luckily, you stay a bit longer with us as a postdoc in the lab, and we get to enjoy your spirit to live a good life. I would also thank your partner Özcan for supporting her stay in the NL while he was in Germany or Turkey the whole time, but who never missed our social events. Son olarak da abini, anneni ve babanı çok kutluyorum. Her şey için tebrikler. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Esteemed Dr. Mamus, on behalf of the Council of Deans, I would like to congratulate you, your partner, your parents, your brother, and other relatives and friends. I'm expressing my congratulations in a multimodal way, including gestures. I sincerely hope, I'm very sure, by the way, that you have perceived this defense as a meaningful experience. I also congratulate your supervisors and co-supervisor on the completion of this research project. Yes, I ask you to stand up, as I would like to close the ceremony with the following words. Gratias tibi agimus omnipotens Deus, pro omnibus beneficiis tuis, qui vivis et regnas per omnia saecula saeculorum. We will leave in procession with the registrar leading and the new doctor amongst us, followed by her co-supervisors and the members of the examination board. And as far as I know, there will be a reception downstairs.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for your presence.